The morning sun cast long shadows across my property as I walked toward the feed storage barn. 23 years I'd been running this cattle operation, and I knew every sound, every routine, every detail by heart. That's why the silence felt wrong. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the weathered wooden doors. The padlock hung open, twisted metal gleaming in the early light. My stomach dropped. Inside, where neat stacks of feed bags should have lined the walls, gaping spaces stared back at me like missing teeth. 40 bags. Gone. I ran my hands through the remaining inventory, counting and recounting. The theft wasn't random. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were taking. Premium cattle feed, the expensive stuff I'd splurged on for the pregnant cows. Each bag represented money I couldn't spare and time I couldn't waste. Walking the perimeter of my barn, I found tire tracks in the soft earth, wide treads, heavy vehicle. The impressions led toward the old dirt road that connected my property to the Hendersons' place next door. My jaw tightened as pieces began falling into place. Sarah Henderson and I had shared this property line for 15 years, mostly in peace. But lately, things had changed. Her husband's death last winter left her struggling, desperate. I'd seen the signs: equipment falling into disrepair, pastures overgrown, that haunted look in her eyes at the feed store. Still, stealing from a neighbor crossed every line that mattered out here. In farming communities, your word and your integrity were all you had. Without trust, we were just strangers trying to survive on adjacent plots of hostile land. The cattle were already gathering at the fence, expecting their morning feed. 40 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting. I had enough stored grain for maybe 3 days. After that, I'd have to buy emergency feed at premium prices I couldn't afford. I drove my truck down the dusty road separating our properties, gravel pinging against the undercarriage. The Henderson place looked worse up close, peeling paint on the farmhouse, a sagging porch and equipment scattered across the yard like abandoned toys. Sarah emerged from her barn as I pulled up, wiping her hands on a faded apron. At 52, she still carried herself with the stubborn dignity of a woman who'd never asked for help, but the strain showed in the lines around her eyes. "Morning, Sarah." "Tom." She nodded, but her gaze flickered toward my truck bed, then quickly away. "Missing some cattle feed, 40 bags from my barn." I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "Tire tracks lead this direction." Her face flushed, but she met my eyes steadily. "That's unfortunate. Theft's a serious problem around here." "Yes, it is." I stepped closer, studying her expression, especially when it's neighbors taking from neighbors. I wouldn't know anything about that. But her voice wavered slightly, and she glanced toward her own barn. "Sarah, I've known you 15 years. Your husband Tom was a good man and I respected him, but stealing my cattle feed puts both our operations at risk. I told you, I don't know. 40 bags of premium feed don't just walk away." My patience frayed. My pregnant cows need that nutrition. Without it, I could lose calves, maybe breeding stock. She straightened, defensive anger replacing guilt. "Maybe you should secure your property better instead of accusing honest neighbors. Maybe you should remember what honest means." We stared at each other across 15 years of neighborly history and one night of desperation. Finally, Sarah turned toward her house. "You can't prove anything, Tom, and I've got work to do." Watching her walk away, I felt something cold settle in my chest. She was right. I couldn't prove it. But I knew, and in a community where reputation mattered more than money, knowledge was enough. The question was what to do with it. That evening I sat on my porch with a beer and a view of Sarah's fields. Her corn was coming along nicely, too nicely for someone who claimed to be struggling financially. Those neat rows represented her hope for financial recovery, maybe her only shot at keeping the farm after Tom's death. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she'd stolen feed to keep her cattle alive, her real money was growing in those perfectly tended acres. Come harvest time, that corn would pay her bills, maybe even turn a profit, unless something went wrong. I'd been farming long enough to know how fragile crops could be. Weather, pests, disease, any number of natural disasters could destroy months of work in days. But there were other vulnerabilities, ones that required human intervention. My phone buzzed with a text from my feed supplier. Emergency delivery would cost double, and they couldn't guarantee arrival before my cattle started showing stress. 40 bags of stolen feed might cost me thousands in vet bills and lost productivity. Sarah's corn swayed in the evening breeze, taunting me with its health and promise. She'd gambled that her desperation justified theft, that I'd absorb the loss rather than fight a grieving widow. Maybe in the past she would have been right, but I wasn't the same man I'd been before my own struggles. 3 bad seasons had taught me that survival sometimes required hard choices. Kindness was a luxury I couldn't afford when someone else's desperation threatened my livelihood. Standing up, I walked to my tool shed and pulled out a small spray bottle, the kind used for spot-treating weeds. I'd used herbicide for legitimate purposes for decades, but tonight I was considering a different application. The plan formed slowly, carefully. It would take timing, patience, and a willingness to cross lines I'd never crossed before. But Sarah had made the first move in this game. She'd forced my hand by stealing what wasn't hers. Now I'd show her the true cost of desperation. 2 weeks passed before conditions aligned perfectly. Sarah had driven to town for her weekly supply run, a routine I'd observed since planning began. Her truck disappeared down the main road at exactly 4:30, giving me roughly 2 hours before her return. The spray bottle felt heavier than it should have as I crossed the property line under cover of dusk. Sarah's cornfield stretched before me, row upon row of healthy plants reaching toward waist height. In 6 weeks, this would be ready for harvest. In 6 weeks, Sarah would discover what happened to thieves in farming communities. I'd done my research carefully. Selective herbicide applied at the wrong growth stage would stunt development without causing immediate obvious damage. The corn would grow slower, produce smaller ears, maybe yield 30% less than expected. Enough to hurt financially, not enough to destroy her completely. Walking between the rows, I began spraying calculated sections. Not every plant, that would be too obvious. Instead, I targeted roughly 1/3 of her crop in a scattered pattern that would look like natural disease or pest damage. The herbicide would work slowly, subtly, giving her hope right up until harvest time. My boots crushed the occasional weed as I worked methodically through the field. Each spray was deliberate, measured. This wasn't random vandalism, it was calculated justice. Sarah had stolen my cattle feed, knowing it would cost me money I couldn't spare. Now she'd learned the same lesson. The work took 90 minutes. By the time I finished, sweat soaked my shirt despite the cooling evening air. I'd covered roughly 8 acres of her 20-acre field, enough to cut her profits significantly, but not destroy her completely. Walking back across the property line, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. This wasn't who I'd been 6 months ago, but circumstances change people. Sarah's theft had forced me into a corner, and cornered animals do whatever it takes to survive. Her headlights appeared on the road as I reached my porch, right on schedule. She'd returned to her routines, never knowing that her harvest was already compromised. The weeks that followed felt like holding my breath underwater. Every morning I found excuses to check Sarah's cornfield from my property line. The herbicide worked slowly, just as I'd planned. The treated plants grew noticeably slower, their leaves showing subtle discoloration that could easily be mistaken for natural stress. Sarah seemed oblivious to the developing problem. I watched her walk through the rows each evening, checking growth and condition the same way all farmers did. From a distance, the differences weren't obvious. You had to know what to look for. My own cattle recovered from the feed shortage, though the emergency purchases had strained my budget significantly. 3 cows showed signs of nutritional stress that might affect their pregnancies. The financial impact of Sarah's theft would ripple through my operation for months. During our inevitable encounters at the feed store and bank, she maintained her facade of innocence about the missing cattle feed. We exchanged polite nods and weather commentary, 2 neighbors pretending that nothing had changed between us, but I caught her studying my face sometimes, searching for signs that I suspected her. If only she knew. The herbicide's effects became more pronounced as July progressed. Sections of her cornfield lagged behind the untreated areas by several inches. The ears that did develop were smaller, less full. Agricultural extension agents would probably blame soil variations or irregular irrigation when she eventually asked for help. One evening, I watched her walking through the affected rows with obvious concern. She pulled several ears for examination, turning them over in her hands with growing frustration. Even from my distance, I could see the disappointment in her posture. Good. Let her worry. Let her feel the same sick uncertainty I'd felt discovering my cattle feed missing. Financial stress was a teacher that left lasting lessons. My phone rang during dinner, interrupting my observations. "Tom, this is Sarah." Her voice carried a strange mixture of pride and desperation. "I was wondering if you might have some advice about corn production. Some of my crop isn't developing as expected." The irony was perfect. The woman who'd stolen from me was now asking for my help dealing with the consequences. "I'll take a look tomorrow," I told her. Sometimes these things work themselves out. Sarah met me at her gate the next morning, coffee cup in hand, and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. She'd aged visibly since her husband's death, but the stress of watching her crop struggle was adding years by the week. "I appreciate you coming over, Tom. I know things have been tense between us lately." "Neighbors help neighbors," I replied, following her toward the cornfield. "That's how things work out here." She led me directly to the worst affected section, where the stunted plants stood in stark contrast to the healthy growth surrounding them. I knelt down, examining the soil and root systems with practiced hands, performing for her benefit. "Soil looks fine," I muttered, pulling up a handful of earth. "pH seems normal. You've been irrigating regularly?" "Same schedule as always. Same fertilizer program too." She gestured helplessly at the struggling plants. "I can't figure out what's wrong." I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands while studying the pattern of damage. Even I had to admit my work looked convincingly natural. Random enough to avoid suspicion, extensive enough to hurt her financially. "Could be a soil fungus," I suggested. "Or maybe some kind of pest pressure, hard to say without lab tests." "Lab tests cost money I don't have." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Tom, I need this harvest to work. Without it—" She didn't finish the sentence, but we both knew the ending. Without a successful harvest, she'd lose the farm. The same financial pressure that had driven her to steal my cattle feed would force her to sell to developers or corporate agriculture. Standing in her damaged cornfield, watching her face crumble with despair, I felt a moment of something that might have been guilt. But then I remembered finding my barn empty, my cattle gathered at the fence expecting food I couldn't provide. "Sometimes farming just kicks you in the teeth," I said quietly. "The best we can do is learn from it and try again next season." Sarah nodded, but tears gathered in her eyes. "There might not be a next season for me, Tom. This was supposed to be my comeback crop." I placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture feeling both genuine and hypocritical. Maybe things will improve before harvest. We both knew they wouldn't. Word traveled fast in farming communities, especially bad news. By August, Sarah's crop problems had become common knowledge at the feed store, bank, and Saturday morning coffee gatherings. Farmers compared theories about soil conditions, pest pressure, and weather patterns, but nobody had definitive answers. I participated in these conversations with careful neutrality, offering suggestions that sounded helpful while knowing they wouldn't solve her real problem. The herbicide had done its work too thoroughly for recovery at this stage. "Shame about the Henderson place," said Jake Morrison, leaning against his truck outside the grain elevator. "That woman's had nothing but bad luck since Tom died." "Farming's a tough business," I replied. "Takes more than luck to survive these days." Still, losing a husband and a crop in the same year. Jake shook his head. "Makes you wonder if she's got some kind of curse on that land." Others nodded in agreement, the superstitious thinking that still lingered in rural communities. Nobody suspected deliberate sabotage. Herbicide damage looked too much like natural crop failure, especially when applied with patience and planning. Sarah herself had grown increasingly desperate and isolated. I watched her driving past my place more frequently, heading to meetings with agricultural agents, soil specialists, and anyone else who might explain her crop's decline. Each consultation cost money she couldn't spare and delivered answers she didn't want to hear. The financial pressure was showing in other ways too. Her equipment sat unused more often, probably to save fuel costs. The farmhouse needed paint and repairs that weren't happening. Even her cattle looked thinner, probably because she couldn't afford premium feed. The same premium feed she'd stolen from my barn. During one of our brief encounters at the post office, she looked directly at me with hollow eyes and asked, "Tom, you ever feel like the whole world is working against you?" "Some seasons are harder than others," I answered carefully. "But things usually balance out eventually." "Balance," she repeated, as if testing the word's meaning. "Yeah, maybe you're right about that." Something in her tone made me study her face more carefully, but she turned away before I could read her expression. September brought the familiar rhythm of harvest preparation, equipment maintenance, storage facility checks, and weather monitoring that consumed every farmer's attention. Sarah's activities took on a desperate edge as she prepared to discover the full extent of her crop failure. I watched from my property line as she walked through her cornfield with increasing frequency, sometimes stopping to examine individual plants with the intensity of someone hoping for miracles. The treated sections were obviously stunted now, producing ears that were 30 to 40% smaller than normal. Her financial situation had deteriorated visibly. The farm equipment showed signs of deferred maintenance, and I noticed her cutting corners on everything from fuel to fertilizer for next year's planning. She was operating in pure survival mode, just as I had been when she stole my cattle feed. The irony was perfect. Her theft had been motivated by desperation, an attempt to solve immediate problems without considering long-term consequences. Now she was experiencing the same kind of cascading financial pressure, only worse because she couldn't steal her way out of crop failure. My own operation had stabilized somewhat. The emergency feed purchases had strained my budget, but the cattle were healthy and the pregnant cows were developing normally. I'd probably break even this year instead of turning a profit, but at least I wouldn't face the kind of catastrophic loss that Sarah was approaching. One evening, I found her standing at our shared property line, staring across my successful cornfield with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. When she noticed me approaching, she quickly looked away. "Evening, Sarah." "Tom." She nodded without making eye contact. "Your crop looks good this year." "Can't complain." "Weather's been cooperative." "Lucky." The word carried more weight than it should have. Some of us aren't having such good luck. We stood in uncomfortable silence, two neighbors separated by more than just a fence line. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "You know, I keep thinking about balance, how things have a way of evening out over time." "What do you mean?" She turned to look directly at me, and for a moment I wondered if she somehow knew what I'd done, but her expression remained unreadable. Just farmer philosophy, I guess. Plant seeds, reap consequences, that sort of thing. Harvest week arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, low humidity, and steady winds that would dry the corn to optimal moisture levels. For most farmers in our area, it was the culmination of months of careful planning and hard work. For Sarah, it was Judgment Day. I positioned my own harvest equipment strategically to maintain clear sightlines to her field. This wasn't just curiosity. I needed to witness the full impact of my sabotage, to confirm that justice had been served for her theft of my cattle feed. Sarah began harvesting on a Tuesday morning, starting with the sections of her field that looked healthiest. Her ancient combine moved slowly through the rows, filling grain carts that should have been overflowing, but instead held disappointing loads. By afternoon, she'd reached the areas I'd treated with herbicide. The combine's progress slowed even further as it struggled to process the stunted, underdeveloped ears. I could see her stopping frequently to check the equipment, probably wondering why the yield had dropped so dramatically. The third day of harvest brought the full revelation. Sarah's entire operation ground to a halt as she stood in her field, surveying the disaster that her crop had become. Even from my distance, I could see the defeat in her posture as she calculated the financial impact. That evening, I found her sitting on her porch steps, staring at grain carts that held maybe 60% of a normal harvest. She looked up as I approached, and for the first time in months, her expression held something other than worry or desperation. "Tom, I need to tell you something." I sat down beside her, maintaining the facade of neighborly concern. "What's on your mind?" "I took your cattle feed." The words came out flat, matter of fact. That night in June, I was desperate, and I convinced myself that you could afford the loss better than I could afford to lose my cattle. Finally, acknowledgement of what I'd known all along. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I understand something I didn't before." She gestured toward her failed harvest. Theft has consequences that go beyond money. When you take something that isn't yours, you create debts that the universe has ways of collecting. I studied her face, looking for signs that she suspected my involvement in her crop failure, but saw only genuine remorse and the hard-won wisdom that comes from catastrophic loss. "What are you going to do now?" "Pay you back somehow. Sell the farm, probably. Start over somewhere else if I can." The victory I'd anticipated felt unexpectedly hollow. The following weeks brought a steady stream of consequences I hadn't anticipated when planning my revenge. Sarah's crop failure rippled through our small farming community in ways that affected everyone, including me. The local grain elevator had counted on her usual contribution to meet their annual contracts. Without it, they struggled to fulfill commitments to larger buyers, creating price pressures that hurt every farmer in the area. My own harvest commanded lower prices because of the regional shortfall Sarah's failure had helped create. Equipment dealers who'd extended credit to Sarah based on expected harvest revenues found themselves holding bad debt. This made them more cautious about financing arrangements with other local farmers, including some deals I'd been counting on for upgrading my aging machinery. Even the bank felt the impact. Sarah's inevitable default would affect their agricultural lending ratios, making it harder for everyone in the community to access operating capital next season. The interconnected nature of rural economics meant that devastating one farm weakened the entire local system. But the personal consequences were the hardest to process. Sarah had indeed paid me back for the stolen cattle feed, selling equipment she couldn't afford to lose in order to make restitution. Her acknowledgement of guilt should have provided closure, but instead, it highlighted the vast disproportion between her crime and my punishment. 40 bags of cattle feed, worth perhaps $800, had cost her the entire farm. My perfectly planned revenge had succeeded beyond all reasonable measures, destroying not just her harvest, but her entire future in agriculture. Standing in my own successful cornfield during the final days of harvest, I tried to recapture the satisfaction I'd felt during the planning stages. Instead, I found myself thinking about balance, the concept Sarah had mentioned several times during our conversations. She'd stolen from me and I'd stolen from her in return, but I'd stolen her entire future, not just a few bags of feed. The scales of justice hadn't balanced. They'd tilted so far in my favor that the equilibrium was completely destroyed. Watching Sarah's farmhouse stand empty as she prepared to move away, I wondered if there was such a thing as too much justice, if revenge could be so complete that it ceased to feel like victory. Sarah's final week on the farm was a study in quiet desperation and forced dignity. I watched from my property as she loaded the last of her possessions into a rented trailer, her movements efficient but heavy with the weight of failure. The farm auction had been brutal, equipment selling for fractions of its value, livestock dispersed to whoever would take them, household items going for almost nothing to neighbors who bid more out of pity than need. The proceeds barely covered her debts, leaving nothing for a fresh start elsewhere. She knocked on my door the evening before her departure, standing on my porch with a small wrapped package in her hands. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady despite everything she'd lost. "Thank me? For not calling the police about the cattle feed, for helping me understand what I'd done wrong." She handed me the package. "This was my husband's. I thought you should have it." Inside the wrapping was an old pocket knife, the kind farmers carried for 100 small daily tasks. The brass was worn smooth from decades of use, and Tom Henderson's initials were barely visible on one side. "Sarah, I can't." "Yes, you can. Tom always said you were the most honest farmer in the county. He'd want you to have it." The knife felt impossibly heavy in my hands, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to process. If Tom Henderson had thought I was honest, what would he think of what I'd done to his widow? "Where will you go?" I asked. "My sister's place in Ohio. Maybe find work in town, try to save enough to start over somewhere." She managed a weak smile. "Maybe farming isn't in my blood after all." We stood in uncomfortable silence, two people who'd known each other for 15 years but had become strangers through desperation and revenge. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Tom, whatever happened to my corn crop, natural causes, bad luck, whatever, I want you to know I don't blame anyone but myself. I brought this on by stealing from you. Sometimes the consequences of our actions take time to catch up with us, but they always do." After she left, I sat on my porch holding Tom Henderson's knife and watching her house go dark for the final time. Tomorrow she'd be gone, and I'd have the satisfaction of knowing that theft had been punished appropriately. So why did I feel like I'd lost something important instead of winning? The Henderson place sold to a development company within 2 months of Sarah's departure. They planned to subdivide the land for rural housing, turning productive farmland into suburban sprawl. The irony was bitter. My successful revenge had contributed to the loss of agricultural land our community desperately needed to preserve. My own farming operation continued successfully, but the satisfaction I'd expected from Sarah's downfall never materialized. Instead, I found myself dwelling on the disproportion between her crime and my punishment, the way my calculated revenge had mushroomed into community-wide consequences. Tom Henderson's pocket knife became a daily reminder of the man whose widow I'd destroyed. I carried it out of some twisted sense of obligation, using it for the same small tasks Tom had performed for decades. Each time I opened the blade, I thought about his reputation for honesty and fairness, qualities that had died with him. The local farming community slowly adjusted to the changes Sarah's departure had created. Credit was tighter, grain prices remained depressed, and the sense of mutual support that had sustained us through previous challenges felt fractured. Her crop failure and subsequent exodus had demonstrated how quickly one farm's problems could cascade through the entire system. I participated in community meetings and social gatherings with the same appearance of normalcy I'd maintained throughout the entire affair. But something fundamental had changed. The other farmers saw me as a successful neighbor who'd weathered recent challenges well, unaware that my success was built on carefully planned sabotage. During quiet moments, early morning cattle checks, late evening equipment maintenance, I found myself replaying the chain of events that had led from 40 stolen bags of cattle feed to the complete destruction of a neighbor's life. The progression felt both inevitable and excessive, justice that had somehow transformed into something darker. Sometimes I drove past the former Henderson place, now marked with developer signs and survey stakes. The cornfield where I'd applied herbicide was already being cleared for roads and utility lines. Within a year, suburban houses would cover the ground where Sarah had lost everything. The perfect crime had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations, but victory had turned out to be indistinguishable from loss. 2 years have passed since Sarah Henderson left our community, and I've learned to live with the consequences of perfect revenge. The local farming economy has recovered somewhat, though we're all still adjusting to tighter credit and reduced cooperation that her departure helped create. The Henderson property is now countryside estates, 15 houses occupied by people who commute to town and have no understanding of agricultural life. They complain about farm odors, early morning equipment noise, and other realities of rural living. The irony is constant. My revenge against one neighbor has brought me dozens of new neighbors who pose greater daily irritations. I still carry Tom Henderson's pocket knife, though I've never been able to decide whether it represents guilt, victory, or just the weight of choices that can't be undone. Sometimes I think about Sarah, wondering if she ever found work in Ohio, if she's managed to rebuild some version of the life I destroyed. The cattle that survived her theft of my feed are now productive members of my herd. The financial impact that seemed so devastating at the time has been absorbed into the normal fluctuations of agricultural income. 40 bags of stolen feed have become a footnote in my operations history, while their theft triggered consequences that permanently altered multiple lives. During community gatherings, I occasionally hear fragments of conversation about what happened to the Henderson place. The general consensus is that Sarah was a victim of bad luck and poor financial management, a cautionary tale about the risks of farming without adequate resources. Nobody suspects that her crop failure was anything other than natural causes. I've become something of an elder statesman in our farming community, respected for my steady operation and willingness to offer advice to struggling neighbors. The irony is perfect. My reputation for helpfulness was built on the foundation of devastating the person who needed help most. But perhaps the deepest consequence is the knowledge I carry about my own capacity for calculated cruelty. Before Sarah's theft, I might have considered myself fundamentally decent, someone who would never deliberately destroy another person's life. Now, I know better. Some nights, lying in bed and listening to cattle moving through pastures that are more productive now than they were 2 years ago, I wonder if there's a difference between justice and revenge, or if both words simply describe the same human impulse dressed in different moral clothing. Sarah was right about balance in the end. Actions do have consequences, and the universe does have ways of collecting debts. But she never understood that the collector might be the person sitting next to you on the porch, holding your husband's knife and planning your destruction. I got exactly what I wanted, perfect revenge for a crime that had genuinely hurt my operation. The fact that it feels more like defeat than victory might just be the final price of justice served too completely. Thank you for listening to this story of rural revenge and its complex consequences. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the darker corners of human nature and small-town life. Your support helps me continue bringing these tales to life.